Okay, good morning, everybody. It is Monday morning. Woohoo! Now, first of all, if you have not taken the quiz, you better, because quizzes are eventually going to go in as zeros, and that's going to really hurt you badly. So, if you have not taken the quiz, get her done. End of the quarter's coming at the end of this month, so take a look at your grades. If you're behind, you need to get things done. Okay. All right. Let's teach the lesson. First period, I'll talk to you about this more in Zoom, and fourth period, I'll talk to you more about this tomorrow in Zoom. So, we have zeros. And zeros are going to be like x-intercepts. But today we're going to talk about something almost the same thing. We're going to talk about roots. The reason we talk about roots instead of zeros, okay, how do I explain this? Okay, roots are going to be any value that makes, let's use good handwriting, makes p of x equals 0. Okay, now that's important because sometimes we have imaginary numbers that are going to make things 0, but they're not x-intercepts. Okay, let me just show you a picture. You could have a picture like this in a polynomial. That is a 0, that's a 0, and an x-intercept. But in here, there's some imaginary values that still make it 0. So let's talk about imaginary numbers. So imaginary numbers, they're not real. They're not part of the real numbers, they're imaginary. So when we talk about this square root of -1, okay, square root of -1 is absolutely impossible. Can't do it. Can't do it. It's not a real number. So if I try on my calculator, clear, I go square root of a -1, does not like it. It says non-real. Non-real. It's not a real number at all. So what I want to do is this. I'm going to call it the number I. Okay, so when you see I, think imaginary numbers. Okay, so then as another example, if I have the square root of -4, that's the same thing as the square root of 4 times the square root of -1, which makes a 2i. Okay, now complex numbers have i's in them and regular numbers. So complex numbers, we say, well, some a plus bi is really the form. That's the true form, but we, as an example, we might have something like a 2 plus a 3i. Okay, that's a complex number because this part of it's a real number. Here, let me get a different color so you guys see this. Okay, that's a real number because 2 is a real number, and then the I is my imaginary. So it's pretty complex, right? We got a real number and an imaginary. We call it a complex number. Okay, they come in pairs. Complex numbers come in pairs. So if you got an a plus bi, you're often going to have an a minus bi. They like to come in pairs, like square roots. Okay. So example 1. First of all, let's take a look at finding the zeros. Now, let's just solve. Well, it won't factor. It will not factor. So if it won't factor, we're going to solve instead. It does not factor. So let's just go plus 8 x squared equals 8. I'll go square root. Now, they come in pairs. You have to have two answers. You must have two answers. So to have two answers, if I take the square root of that, I'm going to get x equals plus or minus the square root of 8. Okay, now, there's a better way to write that answer. There's a better way to write that answer, but that's kind of correct, but there's a better way to write that answer. Let's rewrite this as plus or minus the square root of 4 times square root of 2. And we're going to practice this in our Zoom, don't worry. So square root of 4 times square root of 2 makes square root of 8, but we know what the square root of 4 is. It is a 2, a regular old 2. So we get plus or minus 2 square roots of 2. Now that is two answers. I like the plus or minus, but you could also write as two answers. You could write like this. You could write, 2 square roots of 2 and -2 square roots of 2. Okay, there's that answer. Or you can write it like this, which puts them both together. Okay, all right. Example 2. You'd think it would factor, wouldn't you? But that has to be a minus. It doesn't factor. So we're going to solve. We're going to solve. Okay, let's solve this one also. Let's go ahead and go minus 4 of x squared equals negative 4. Okay. And then when I square root this, to get rid of the square root, it's just like this one up here. I did that all on purpose. So the square root of negative 4 can be rewritten as 2i, because the square root of 4, square root of negative 1, the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of negative 1 is an I. Now, but there's got to be two answers. Has to be two answers. So there's a positive and a negative. There are my two answers. Okay, it's a plus or minus 2i. And again, we're going to talk more about this in our Zoom meeting. So hopefully you guys will catch on to this, okay? All right, example 3. Let's go through it. I'm going to go minus 4. I'm going to solve it. I'll have parentheses x minus 2 squared equals negative 4. Okay, I want to solve this. So I'm going to undo the square by taking the square root. Okay, the square root takes care of the square. I'm just left with an x minus 2. And then this one we just did it above. That's a plus or minus 2i. Square root of negative 4, square root of 4, square root of negative 1, which makes a 2, and that's my I. Square root of negative 1 is I, it's imaginary. Okay, now, I got to solve, so I'm going to go plus 2, plus 2. Now, that is a real number, that's an imaginary. So we cannot add them, but we rewrite it as x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2i, okay? And there are two answers. I mean, you could write it out long ways if you wanted to. You could say, oh gosh, where's my two answers? One is 2 plus 2i, and the other is 2 minus 2i, okay? There are two answers, okay? And these are roots. These are roots. If I were to plug these numbers into my original, they make my equation be 0, okay? All right, moving on. And we will again talk about this in our Zoom more. Okay, quadratic formula. If you don't remember the quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, that's quadratic formula. We learned that last year. And what we learned was that it helps us solve for x squareds, okay? So this quadratic formula here we can use to solve for x squared, which we're going to do, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at this, okay? We learned last year. There's my a. There's my b. And there's my c, right? So let's plug those into my quadratic formula, okay? So let's put our a in for the a. Let's put our b in for the b's. And put our c, our 5 in for the c. So here we go. To solve this, we're going to go negative 2, because that's my b, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 2 squared, right? Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 5, all over 2 times a, which is 2 times 1. Okay, now that's a mess, but we can fix it, okay, because we can just do the math. That's easy. So negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 20 all over 2. 2 times 1. Now, 4 minus 20, that's a negative 16, isn't it? Negative 16. Oh, negative 16. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Square root of negative 16 all over 2. Okay, I knew I needed two answers. Right? I know I need two answers, and I get it from the plus or minus. But let's finish this up. Let's do a little side work. What is the square root of a negative 16? Well, that's going to be the square root of 16 and the square root of negative 1. The square root of 16, that's easy. That's 4. But this, you can't do. But we know that the square root of negative 1 is I. It's that imaginary number. So let's rewrite this. We're going to have negative 2 plus or minus 4i, right, Square root of 16 is 4, and then the negative square root makes an I all over 2. And then finally, I'm just going to reduce. I'm going to reduce that to a negative 1 plus minus 2i. And there are two answers there. There really are. Negative 1 plus 2i reduced, and negative 1 minus 2i. Okay, there's my two answers. Okay. Now, example 5. So there are 3 answers. Before we find our 3 answers, we need to factor this. So we learned how to factor perfect cubes last week. We're going to use that formula. So I'm going to rewrite this. Let me rewrite this as a x cubed plus a 2 cubed. And then I know that my a is x and my b is 2. All right, so let's plug them in. So let's go into a plus b, okay? So instead of a and b, it's how about x plus 2. And then we're going to factor this into a squared, which would be a x squared, minus ab, which would be minus a 2x, plus a b squared. Well, b is 2, so 2 squared is plus 4 equals 0, okay? Now, first one's easy. There's my little mini equation. X plus 2 equals 0. Boom, that's easy. X equals negative 2. Okay, that's one of 3 answers. That's one of 3 answers. Now, to get the other 2 answers, we're going to have to factor this, but it doesn't factor. It doesn't factor. So if it doesn't factor, oh, I know. If it doesn't factor, we have everybody's favorite, the quadratic formula. Okay, so we're going to do the quadratic formula with this part. So a is 1, b is negative 2, and c is 4. Let me write that down, okay? So a is 1, b is negative 2, and c is 4. Okay, so let's do the quadratic formula. Okay, here we go. Negative b, so I'm going to go negative 2, which is a positive 2, right? Plus or minus big square root b squared, so I'm going to go negative 2 squared, which is a positive 4, minus positive 4, right? That's squared, minus 4, because that's the formula, times a, which is 1, times c, which is 4, all over 2 times a, which is 1. Okay, now let's simplify this, okay? Okay, I've got a positive 2, my bad, plus or minus square root of 4 minus 16 over 2. Okay, slide it up so you can see it. So let's see what I got. I've got a 2 plus minus the square root of negative 12 over 2. Now I think we're going to have an I because I got a square root of a negative. So let me do a little bit of work on the side. Square root of negative 12. Let's see. That could be the square root of 4, square root of 3, square root of negative 1, right? 4 times 3 and negative 1. Now I wanted the 4 because I can take the square root of 4. So we change this to 2 square root of 3. Can't take the square root of 3. It's an ugly number. Times I. Okay, I'm going to put that right there. So let me rewrite it. I've got a 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 3i over 2 because I put this right there. Okay, then I'm going to reduce my 2's, and I'll have as an answer, a 1 plus or minus the square root of 3i. Now, 3 answers. Where are they? Well, here we go. Got one answer here, two answers here, and then the third answer is there. There's my roots. Okay, that's all I have. We'll talk about this more in Zoom because this is kind of weird and kind of hard, so we'll practice it together.